My next guest is Christian Gregory of Drie Fonteinen. This is my second time with Gregory on this stage. A few years back, you were here as a representative of Shelton Brothers on a panel discussion where we were talking about the sort of the emerging market for these beers and how it was shifting at the time. And now you're back as a representative of a single brand, which is a very incredibly important one to this crowd that we're in front of right now. I want to start by addressing some news, that's come up in the last week or so of the passing of Armand, who I know is really exceptionally important to a lot of folks here, especially among the producers, and is somebody that you've known for years. For folks who don't know, can you bring us up to speed a little bit on, for anybody this might be news for, bring them up to speed a little bit on the situation and sort of how the family's handling it all and what's transpired in the last week or so.
Sure, yeah. Oh, I am on. Well, it's kind of a bummer of a way to start. But, since 2010, really, Armand started realizing he was kind of getting toward the end of his career, and he couldn't just, keep laboring away as he had previously. So he started looking for people to sort of succeed him. We can get into that more later. But fast forward to, say, 2018, I think, is when he really took his formal, his pension, his retirement. And almost immediately after he started to enjoy life outside of the brewery, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. And he handled it pretty well. He was on some experimental treatments, and mostly he was just exhausted all the time. But was doing fairly well until relatively recently. Back in January, he had a very close call with a lung infection, and we thought he had pulled through, and then all of a sudden, got the news. It wasn't a shock, but everybody is still pretty broken up about it. It has been really, really, warming though, to see everybody telling their stories about Armand. And knowing kind of how many people he touched, whether it was just somebody who came into the brewery sort of randomly and saw him and said, "Hey, Armand, I love your beer," and then they'd sit there for 2 or 3 hours hearing all these stories, hearing him spill all of his emotions out, because he was always just so warm and open and kind of welcoming. And I think that's a big part of why this succession might succeed. It's because he was always open to hearing new ideas. I mean, he's the most sort of staunch, steadfast traditionalist who is so set in his ways and set in the history and the culture, and not making sure that he was sticking with that, but at the same time also realizing that, even though he might, he's one of the pillars of the lambic world, he was still open to just taking in new people, hearing what they had to say, and sort of seeing how that fit in with his philosophy and, that culture. So,
I mean, it's not thanks for sharing that. I know it's not a fun situation to have a seat and have to talk about something like that. When you know somebody like that, and you know the brand so well, and you know the family around it and what it means to everybody, you're used to telling a story of that's joyful and generational and whatnot. It's not you never imagine being in this position, so I can appreciate that might be difficult. It strikes me as a bit unique in American culture to hear about a brewer planning for succession in that way. I mean, everything in the U.S., even in the tradition of wild ales, maybe especially so, is still so new that not a lot of folks have really thought about it generationally yet, if ever. But I know for Armand, that's been a common theme for him for a while, and he's been planning for that and sort of meticulously working towards that. How does that work its way into not just the culture of the brewery back home, but even into a role for somebody like you here that's on, that's stateside, thinking about the longevity of that brand?
I'll say I feel like a bit of a poser sitting up here. I was at Shelton
Nothing
Brothers.
but grace for that. I understand.
But I was at Shelton Brothers for like 12 years, and I when I started there, the first conversation I had with a brewer was in 2009, immediately after the thermostat, the catastrophe, where I think it was 80,000 bottles were lost all at once. The brewery was on the edge of bankruptcy, and I was thinking, like, man, what did Armand was clearly distraught, and in any case, I'm just rambling now. But Yeah, the succession thing is interesting because, I mean, he took over from his father, Gaston. Drie Fonteinen was owned by three other families before that, starting in the 1880s. And it was, I think Jeffrey was talking about this earlier, but it is this sort of the bedrock of it is the culture. It's not trendy or anything. People are just brewers, and it's just been linked to every part of life for such a long time. But yeah, I guess his father bought the brewery in 1953. He would have been 2 years old at that point. And I mean, I remember him telling me stories about when he was like 5 or 6 years old. He was already in the cellar in the brewery, stacking bottles and helping out. So he grew up with it, and I think it was the 80s when he more or less took over from his father in terms of doing the majority of the blending. And I think, I can't remember exactly, and my Dutch is terrible, but his dad basically said, "You're a dummy for trying to continue this because only old people drink goes." So in a way, it's interesting because he was taking over. He thought it was really important to continue the tradition, but at the same time, he was almost being discouraged from doing that.
I think any parent would communicate both of those things, both pride and trepidation for the legacy of something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, the other little interesting tidbit is Armand was always in the kitchen. He was the chef. He went to school. If you ever have been to the Drie Fonteinen Cafe, which is, it's owned by Armand's brother Guido, and rather his nephew now, Thomas. Yeah, Armand was just in the kitchen all the time there and kind of blending in his spare time, which was also kind of the tradition at all these cafes. They would all blend their own goods. They would buy wort from all these lambic producers all over, and I can't remember exactly how many were in the tiny little town of Bersel at one point, but I mean, there were just hundreds of cafes that would do their own goods. That was just how it worked.
I mean, they would basically just almost like Solera method, right? They would just have like a vessel that they would blend and serve as their own kind of continuously.
I'm sure it depended on the specific cafe and how careful people were about what they were doing. But yeah, I mean, it was kind of just...
It's a messy process.
Yeah, somebody kind of just taught you what they did and you carried that on. And I mean, that's actually going back to your original question. Michael, who is the current sort of head brewer, blender, overseer of all things in terms of production. He started with no background at all in lambic. He came from, I think he was doing accounting work. That was his formal training, and he just wanted to work with his hands. He was so sick of, the tedium, I guess. And he just applied for a job that was very nondescript literally in the classified section, saying we need a helper in a brewery, and showed up, and Armand sort of immediately clicked with him. And yeah, part of this succession was how he was. Armand thought that, first of all, his palate was fantastic, and at one point I remember Armand saying, like, I think it's better than mine. But a big part of it was just teaching sort of by feel, because I mean, I guess you can look at recipes, you can do all that sort of thing with traditional beer, but with lambic, it's really knowing like how something's going to evolve in the barrel over this many years, or not knowing and just being accepting of that. Yeah, but the whole approach to the craft, I guess, is based on just like experience, taking on what someone like Armand might show you, and going from there. So,
now, let's talk about your role a little bit, because I think it's unique. When we think about these small producers of wild ales, we tend to think about the producer themselves, and in some case, it's like an individual, and that's often the case when they're very small. But we don't necessarily think about representatives or salespeople or distribution networks and importing those kinds of things. And you've worked in various pieces of that value chain yourself over the years. Last time we talked, as I mentioned, you were with Shelton Brothers, and you were representing a wide variety of producers, many of which are in the same tradition as Drie Fonteinen, but many that are of very different traditions. And that's a wide sort of breadth of things to have to, stories to tell, beers to share. It's a wide variety of things. Now you're sort of the holder of one story, of one brand, and at a very unique time in its history. What has it been like for you, just as an individual, as Christian Gregory, to transition from the holder of many stories to maybe the holder of one story? How does something like that affect you? How's your day-to-day changed as a result of the changing of those kinds of roles?
It's been a relief. No, Shelton Brothers was great for a very long time. I really appreciate that, and especially the thing I most miss is all the relationships with all these people. And I mean, I'm still talking to Yvan from De La Seine all the time, or Jean from Cantillon, or whomever. So I miss the I guess the business excuse to talk with those guys as frequently as I used to. But they're still friends, so I like that. And conveniently, my wife works for the new importer of a lot of these breweries and our brewery. So she is in touch and kind of filling me in with what they're doing. So that's the biggest part that I feel like I've lost. But on the flip side, it is so nice to just have some focus and be able, and especially like, working for Drie Fonteinen it was this sort of massive honor to get asked to come on board. And yeah, it's I don't know, the day-to-day of it. It's just so nice to wake up in the morning, get excited about what you're about to do, and basically, which is sharing the story of Lambic. When I started, I was asking, like, is there a goal to increase sales or anything like that? And the answer was basically no. It's an interesting role because it's like I'm sort of a sales guy, but I'm not really trying to sell more. I'm just trying to share what we're doing and make sure people understand like everything that's put into it and the history behind it and why we do things the way we do. So yeah, it's unique for sure, and it's so nice to be able to sit back and I guess be more thoughtful about what we're doing. Yeah, and really think about the future too, instead of sort of reacting always. You can really look at what's next.
Well, I mean, with a portfolio as large as you were representing before, there was always something to react to, I would imagine. Something's stuck somewhere, somebody has a need, or you're making a drop off or meeting somebody new that's taking over a bar, and I would imagine it was pretty hectic.
Yeah, and then there was you mentioned this, and this is kind of like the most to me it's kind of exciting. But one of the most boring aspects of the whole beer industry is like the distribution franchise laws and things like that. So it was a lot of reacting to like, okay, this distributor wasn't selling enough of this tiny esoteric brand because they were selling this hazy whatever. That's cool. But and we would just say, okay, we need to move on to somebody else who can really, again, tell the story or just have the passion for it. So that was a huge part of it. That was a huge part of reacting to everything and kind of getting super stressed. And yeah, now that's for the most part gone, and I like just thinking about the beer.
How important are places like Green Bench and Web City and places where they really specialize in the presentation of these things? How important are these kinds of places to some of those goals, which is education and connection and sort of like, can you build, do you use this as like a gravity point and maybe build around it for other bars and restaurants? Like, are you able to point to this and say like these people are helping build awareness and sort of, is it incremental at that point, or is it really just like exists as a destination in isolation?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, what they're doing in Webb's, I haven't been to Webb since the opening, and it was shocking. It's a beautiful bar, and like all the bartenders in there are fantastic. Everybody's super knowledgeable, and that's huge because I mean, I'll be in a, I'm not knocking Total Wine at all. Some stores are fantastic, but I'll go into other stores and it's like people don't know what it is. It just kind of collects dust on the shelves, and I think. Our stuff is expensive, and I can talk about why that is for sure, but that's a whole different thing. But it really takes somebody knowing what this is, why it's different, and getting excited about it. I think that's the biggest thing is like, if somebody is just, psyched about what they're serving you, you're going to sell a whole lot more beer. And again, we're not trying to sell more. We want that excitement. We want people to know it took 4 or 5 years to make this beer. It's coming from this long tradition and so on and so forth. And yeah, it's only places like Webb's and maybe a handful of others that can kind of start that. And then we definitely see other folks sort of realizing what it is. It
really does seem like this part, even within the broader realm of wild ales, it seems like this part of Lambic and Goose really does travel person to person more than anything else. I mean, there's nobody advertising for the category, right? Like it really does seem like it takes that sort of hand-to-hand sort of conversation to happen, and that is based on somebody getting excited enough about it that they're willing to just sort of like spill those details out over a bar even when nobody's asking about it.
Yeah, for sure. No, I guess my big challenge right now is, if we're gonna get or bring on new customers, I feel like most people in the sort of beer space mostly know what Lambic is, if they've been around for a little bit. But we see so many parallels with wine, natural wine, that we really think there's sort of a place for a goose and a place that specializes in only natural wine. So that's what I've been up to. I mean, I love natural wine.
So are you saying like the sort of specialization on the retail side in that kind of wine is helping in some way?
Well, no, we're trying to sort of tell the story about what this goose is, why in a lot of ways it's actually more similar to natural wine production than it is to beer production. I mean, it's all about kind of letting the beer create itself and just sort of guiding it along.
Remember I was in, we were talking about this a little bit with Jeffrey just a few minutes ago, but I was at Ordinaire in Oakland, a great natty wine bar, and I was there with some folks from New Belgium, Lauren, for example, and we were there and we had some stuff in the back, some really old La Folie and whatnot, and we asked if we could just like walk around and maybe offer some to people just to like, see what they would think, because I had this idea for an experiment in mind, and walked around and just offered people some beer, and the first reaction was like, I'm drinking wine, and then I was like, well, this is natural beer, and they were like, oh, and then they would just like lean in a little bit, and they were happy to have a taste. There does seem to be some interest, I think, and the conversation you get to have with retailers who are working in that space now, like the vocabulary that is being, there's a lot of education happening around natural wine, whether it's a server or a bartender, bar owners and retailers themselves, like that vocabulary is suddenly rich and interesting. Seems to have an effect there. Or you have a receptive audience, perhaps, for the story.
For sure, yeah. I was actually at Ordinaire a few weeks ago myself, so left a sample bottle.
Yeah. I know over the years, you mentioned like the goal not being growth for Drie Fonteinen in terms of increasing volumes or increasing sales necessarily. But there's longevity in that, and that comes from kind of growing in other ways, I would imagine. So what are some ways in which the brewery and the organization and the team there has kind of maybe, I don't know, increased the depth of the operation in some way, or built up an infrastructure around it that really supports some of those goals in other ways that are not necessarily sales or volume oriented?
Yeah, so prior to COVID, the plan was to increase production a little bit, not to go crazy, but to basically try to meet demand more. Currently, we're at 3,000 hectoliters a year in total production, 2,600 barrels, something like that. If we get bigger, it's going to be maybe 3,200 hectoliters. So, I mean, a tiny bit of growth, and that's mostly just to basically have more old lambic in stock. So we increase the average age of our goods, so we get back. Well, now I'm going on a tangent. But the idea really is when COVID hit, we were thinking, okay, no, we're not going to increase production. Instead, we'll turn our resources back toward basically making the beer better, getting closer to the roots. One thing Armand was really passionate about, I think it was in 2017, and I don't know if anybody heard the recent Craft Beer and Brewing podcast. I'm just going to repeat some of that. But he had this huge idea that was like, we've gotten away from brewing with local ingredients, the stuff from our own, the garden in our backyard. I think it's something like 3% of all the grain used in Belgian brewing is from Belgium. The other 97% is from elsewhere. And he was really passionate about getting back to, the historic use of these heirloom wheat and barley varietals. So that's kind of been a huge focus of ours recently, is this cereals collective. So we work with 11 local farmers, been visiting seed banks in the U.S. and elsewhere, trying to recover some of these old, some of these, like the Little Redhead from Brabant is the name of this wheat varietal that was kind of just like the standard for the wheat used in lambic, which is, it's very important because 30 or 40% of the grain bill is raw wheat. And that was just, it had disappeared more or less in brewing entirely. So bringing that back and bringing the sort of terroir and that character has been a big thing.
I mean, the trick about things like that is that bringing them back is, it's part of that tradition, but it's not a part of, like, there's a reason they don't exist now, is because they weren't necessarily commercially viable or competitive in a way that they would need to be a part of a larger brewing system. But to bring them back at a time when there's enough interest and there's enough of an industry for something like lambic in 2022, which that was not a guaranteed thing over the last 30 years. It seems like it's a moment in time where some of those things can be brought back, at least in a small and sustainable way. And I would imagine that the conversation there is not necessarily about making these grains, a major industry again. It's about everybody in that value chain having enough that it's at least worthwhile, right?
Yeah, that's a huge thing for us, is just making sure the farmers are paid fairly, so that they're in a position to keep doing what they're doing. We'll pay them a sort of deposit when they start planting sowing the seeds, just to make sure that if something goes south, they're still okay. So yeah, we want this sustainable for the long term. I mean, we're literally getting like a handful of these grains at some, and propagating it from there. Some of this is going to take 7 years before we see the first results. So it's a long-term project, like a long-term vision of the future that started with Armand. Now we have a guy on staff full-time, Lucas, he has a PhD in ecology with a focus on these heirloom grains. Like all he does is grain. And we rent a big like storage facility with silos and stuff just to store this stuff, to take it off the farmer's hands. So it's become a huge part of the brewery. So we're 20 people total now, I think, which is so different from when I first met Armand. It was just him and maybe a friend or two helping out. But we've grown in kind of a different way from most, where we're really looking at all these different little aspects that aren't necessarily like, I don't know, people's ears don't perk up when you're like, hey, check out this ancient grain, man. But it's really, it was always important to Armand. It's important to us. And then I guess on the other side, we have been trying to really diversify in terms of like what fruits we're offering. So I mean, it was always Creek, framboise, cherries and raspberries, and we realized we can use other local fruits. I mean, a lot of other people have been branching out. Armand branched out a long time ago, didn't have a ton of success, and kind of just decided not to pursue it. But Mikael and Werner, they've really sort of, along with the other folks, have really like gone deeper into this. So we're working with some local wineries, some French and German natural wineries also. Local farmers doing peaches, plums, kind of anything that makes sense to put in there, and some things that don't. But then we just don't release those. So.
I mean, it's funny to think that even with something like fruited lambic, like timing is everything, right? I mean, 5 or 10 years ago, we weren't really talking about fruited beers the way we talk about them now. I mean, right now, even sales data will show you that anything fruited just has like a ridiculous amount of energy around it from a sales perspective. And it's not, super clear as to like where things like that come from like when we're talking about the market in general, those trends are very hard to sort of pin on something. But lambic seems to be in a position right now where it can take advantage of that to introduce people to, some things that were, actually very, very traditional and are not part of a new trend at all. But it's like, people are talking about fruit in a new way. There's some energy there. There's a chance to reintroduce an old idea. And get a little bit of attention for it in a way that could be really important to the longevity of the tradition. But they kind of come and go in different ways.
Yeah, and I mean, the funny thing now is people are so excited about the fruit that they forget about goose. And like that's kind of always been the cornerstone. And I think generally speaking, all of our favorites at the brewery. And actually, I don't know if everybody's had the Geturfd, the two different blends that we had up there, but I was telling Chris earlier, like it's kind of the most exciting beer for me right now that we're doing. It was an accident, actually. I'll just go straight into it. We do this beer, Drie Fonteinen, that I think we're also pouring tonight, sherry barrel aged. That's another big part of this diversification program, is finding different barrels from producers who have a sort of like-mindedness, and a lot of the sherry producers do. Very hard-headed, very, very traditional, even to the detriment of the business. But anyway, so Drie Fonteinen, normally it has this very sherry-forward character, and we normally work directly with the bodega, but this time it was from barrels from a broker, and we didn't realize they had been charred between leaving the sherry producer and when they got to us. So as soon as the guys took the bungs out and sniffed the barrels, it was like, whoa. But yeah, we just decided to fill them anyway, and it turned out to be this like really happy accident. I don't particularly love peated things in general, but for me,
it's not a subtle character.
No, but here I think it works, and it is fairly subtle. And the cool thing is the two different batches are pretty different to me. If you taste the 61, for me it's a little bit more forward, and the 62 is more mellow. But yeah, so anyway, just back to the original point. The goose it probably takes the most skill to make. It takes the longest to make, especially when we're doing things like the Golden Blend or Platinum Blend, where we have we have 6-year-old lambic in barrels right now in the brewery. So yeah, as much as like the fruit stuff is very cool. It carries on the tradition for sure. It's at least in the spirit of the tradition. But I do wish there would be a little bit more appreciation, I guess, for the stuff without fruit.
I mean, it's an interesting phrase to use of a diversification program in a brewery that is as traditional as Drie Fonteinen is. I would imagine that there's a lot of discussion around what those parameters are of what diversification is going to mean. And I would imagine that there's been some discussion over time about where they would and would not go in pursuit of that diversification. Based on the discussions you've been privy to, at least, what are some of the ways in which they've interpreted that word diversification when it comes to the beers that they want to make?
So really, we're just looking at what we can do to keep with tradition, keep with the same philosophy, but kind of sort of have fun with it, and also just see, we worry that we're missing out on this beautiful beer that would never be made if we were to, just stick with the same old. So, I mean, for example, with all the fruit beers, we're only ever using whole fruit. I guess like with grapes, we'll remove the stems, but it's, all skins, all seeds. Nothing is ever pureed. Nothing is ever, we don't do punch downs. We don't do anything like that. It's just fruit thrown into normally a barrel. We do some stainless still with the higher production stuff, but we're moving more and more toward fully wood macerated fruit lambic. So yeah, it's doing the same thing we've always been doing, just with a little bit of a twist.
And when it comes to sourcing the barrels, it sounds like you're pulling them from a wide variety of sources, or at least what process they have been a part of in terms of like what flavors they might impart on the final beer. How wide of a spectrum are we talking about there in terms of diversification?
So at this point, our barrel sourcing is more or less all direct from the winery, the sherry bodega. We have some cognac and Armagnac producers we've been talking to. We're not looking at like mezcal or anything, or bourbon or anything like that. But anytime there's this sort of, like I was saying, like-mindedness and kind of a similarity, and we think it's really going to jibe with what the lambic is, might as well try it. So there are like little one-off barrels here and there tucked around the brewery for sure. A lot of them, they might be 250 liters or 400 liters or something like that. So they're never going to be put out there until we're certain it actually does taste like a Drie Fonteinen beer.
You mentioned a little bit about how like the fruited lambic is really sort of capturing the attention right now compared to goose. What is it about goose that really captures your imagination? It sounds like that's super close to your heart personally. What is it about that really speaks to you on a personal level?
The first, actually maybe even the first sour beer I ever had was a goose. I'd spent a little time living in Belgium when I was in college, and I remember having it was actually a bottle of Cantillon, but I had Drie Fonteinen soon after, and it was just like, wow, this is totally unlike anything else. And there was just there's like a depth to it, I guess, and then there's this, you learn more about it, and I think it's the appreciation for all the history that's gone into this, but also just the sheer amount of work and I guess the know-how it takes to actually blend something that tastes it has all of these different flavor components, but they all just mesh in such a way. And like the stuff that really blows my mind that now that I'm starting to understand more that I never really thought about before is like, when Mikael is blending these, he's not only thinking about what it tastes like, after a year in the warm room when it comes out for sale, he's thinking about what it'll taste like 10 years from now or whatever. And I think that's like it. I don't know how you get to that point where you can know that. But yeah, anyway, I just find it really sort of admirable. So it's not so much that it's just the, what it tastes like. It's all this stuff that goes into that.
The majority of the life of most of these bottles is going to be spent on a shelf or in a cellar or in a fridge or behind a bar until the moment they're drank. In some cases that that'll be 3 times as long as it's spent becoming goose.
Yeah.
And so it has its own life in a way. and it's built for that.
Yeah, and I mean, tasting the 2001 earlier, I think it's a little past its prime at this point. I think it's fair to say, but it's really interesting how it's evolved, and it's this living thing in a bottle. So, yeah.
Does anybody have a question for Gregory? I'm sorry, Christian Gregory.
I've got 3 first names. It's all good.
Yeah, over here. So she said the expiration date on a lot of the Drie Fonteinen bottles is about 20 years. It sounds like she wants to know why specifically 20 years.
So it's actually in Belgium, you legally have to put an expiration date on the bottle. A lot of brewers, like one of my favorites, Daranka, they put 5 years on every beer, even though they make these beautiful hoppy, kind of delicate beers. And basically, they just have to choose an arbitrary date. And the thing is, a lot of their Belgian customers and our customers, I mean, now we have so much information on the bottle. You know, I can tell you like which barrel this thing or that came from. But for a while, a lot of brewers would just put a date because all of their regular customers who would drive up to the brewery, grab a crate of beer every week or two or whatever, they would know, okay, at such and such brewery, they put this many years, and so this beer is whatever old. For us, I think 25 years just seemed to make sense because, I mean, I've had some really nice bottles of old goose like that, but it is a legal requirement. We have to put a best before date on it. I think if we were able to choose, we would just have the bottling date and the other information, but yeah, we have to include it.
There's some confidence in that number.
Yeah, the oldest bottle I've had is from 1959, and that was way past its prime and kind of almost undrinkable, but it was interesting. So yeah, I mean, the arc of Lambic, I mean, so much too has to do with where it's cellared. I mean,
sure, everybody
here knows this, but yeah, I can have such a variety, even bottle to bottle sometimes with like the cork quality. So the best before date doesn't mean a whole lot to us. We just have to throw it on.
Is there a window in which you prefer Drie Fonteinen's goose to be in to your own personal taste?
I think it just varies so much blend to blend. I mean, that's another thing that we kind of like want to talk about more is how each blend is its own thing. Like we're not looking for a uniform product. We're looking for a goose that's going to become whatever it becomes. So I tend to like them in like the 3 to 5 year window, I think. But it really so depends on the blend batch or whatever itself.
Sure. Great. All right. Well, thanks for joining me. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming back again.
Thanks for having me.
And thoughts are with the family, of course. I'm sure so many people here who, if they've had a chance to meet him or know Armand and the family, it's meant a lot to them over the years. So, unique moment in time for sure.
For sure. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.